So we've spoken about while loops, and now we're going to talk about for loops. What is a while loop? A while loop is while a condition is true, repeat the code. What is a for loop? A for loop is for this bunch of stuff, do this. You'll see what I mean in a moment. So for loops, we're going to start by going through a list. So if you remember back in last time when we spoke about lists over here, so we had this nice little list. You know what? Let's make a new list. We'll call our list nums for numbers, and we're going to have 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. So just a couple of odd numbers in the list. And now we're going to write a for loop. So for loop, the syntax is going to be a little bit different from a while loop. You'll see a for loop is going to have for instead of while. Obviously, there's the first difference. Now we're going to go for num in numbers. For num in nums. So for a particular number, for each number in the list of numbers. That's what that line means. For each number in the list of numbers, do the following. Print num. Now, how many times will this run? Let's find out. So I'm going to run my code, and it just runs for each number and prints out the end result. Now, it might not be super obvious what's happening here, so let's do something a little bit different. Instead of just printing out, we're going to print out the number times 2. So now if I run this, 2, 6, 10, 14, 18, 22. What's it doing? What's the value of num? So every time the loop runs, the value of num is the next thing on the list. So in this case, I have a list of numbers, but I could just as easily have a list of strings, right? So we'll do that in a second. But I can just as easily have a list of strings, or I can just as easily have a list of anything else. And no matter what I have a list of, the for loop is going to go through each item on the list and do whatever it says inside this loop until it gets to the end of the list, and then it stops. Now, here I'm using a list. I don't have to just use a list. I can use what's called an iterable. An iterable is something that I can go over, something I can iterate over. So in this case, it's a list. In other cases, it might be a range, which is a range of numbers, which we're going to talk about ranges in a moment. And in other cases, it might be some other collection of data. How we collect data different ways, like I said, I've mentioned it a few times in different videos. It comes up later on in Python, because Python has some very cool tools for doing that, but for now it doesn't really matter. For now we're focused on for loops. So a for loop takes everything in the list. Now, something important to realize here is we're not accessing this in a way that we can change it. So for example, if I print out nums, if I print nums over here, right? And if I print nums again at the end, nums is going to have the same value both times, right? The value of nums doesn't change. My list at the start and my list at the end is the same. If I want to change something in my list, I have to do, so let's say if I want to actually change the value of something in my list, I have to do something like nums 0, right? So let's say the first item in nums plus equals 3. So now if I run that, you see how the first item now changed to 4, right? The 1 becomes a 4 at the end of my program. Why? Because I'm accessing the 1 and I'm actually changing it. So for loop, if I just go through all the items, I'm accessing the items, I'm able to do stuff with the items, but I don't get to manipulate the items themselves. How would I do that? Well, I would need to, instead of go through each item on the list, I would need to get the value for that index, right, for that place in the list, and edit it based on that. So I can still use a for loop, except I got to use something different. I got to use something which I mentioned a moment ago called a range. What is a range? A range is a fancy built-in Python thing that gives me a list of numbers. And a range, you'll notice some of the range syntax is actually going to be very similar to lists. But I'll explain what I mean in a moment. So I'm not going to use a range on its own. I'm going to use a range as part of a for loop. But understand here that a range is just a separate thing, right? In this for loop, I have this nums, which is my list, and now I'm going to have a new for loop. Just going to comment out this part. And now I'm going to have a new for loop that's going to go through a range, which is just another kind of list. So for n in range, and now what's my what's a range? A range is something that has a start. A range is just a list of numbers, so it has to have a start and a stop, right? And technically, it can have a start, a stop, and it can have just a stop. It can have a start and a stop, or it can have a start, stop, and rate of change. I will show all of those in examples, but we'll start with something simple. We'll start with just a stop. Now I want the stop to be, how many items do I have in my list? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I don't have to count the items in my list though, right? We have a way of getting the items. We have the way of getting the number of items in a list. If I just go length nums, now I'm going to have now it's going to be the number of items in the list. So before I start doing anything more, I want to print out n. So I'm going to run my loop, and it's just going to print out n every time. So the value of n is going to be 0 to 5. A range, so I'm going to replace length with 6, right? Because we know that length is 6, just to make this as simple and clear as possible. So it goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then it stops. A range is a list of numbers. So the same way over here when I was printing nums, I was printing out a list of my numbers, right? When I go over here, I print out a list of numbers. When I go over here, I print out a different list of numbers. In this case, it's all the numbers in order from 0 to 6, not including 6. It never includes the last number. So if we run this, it creates a 6. It just generates 0 to 5. Now, like I was saying, when I have one number in a range, it does the start. When I have two numbers, it does the end. When I have two numbers, it does the start and the end. So if I say 1, 6, now my range is going to be starting at 1, including 1, and going to 6. Now the last thing that I have is I can have my start, my end, and my rate of change. What is a rate of change? A rate of change is what number is how many jumps do I take between numbers. So in this case, I would do 1, 3, 4. It's 1, 3, 5. Why? Because it's 1, and then instead of just adding 1, which is what it does by default, it would add 2. So 1 adds 2, and then next one is 3. Is that less than 6? Yes, so we keep going. We get 3 plus 2 is 5. Is 5 less than 6? Yes, so we keep going. 5 plus 2 is 7. Is 7 less than 6? No, so we ignore that one. We stop at 5. That's how range works. So a range is a list of numbers. If I put one number in it, it just goes until that number. If I put from 0 to that number, if I goes 2 numbers in it, goes from the first number to the second number. And if I do 3 numbers, from the first number to the second number at the rate of change of the given number. Now there's a couple of weird things I'm sure you're thinking about. What happens if I do 6, 1? Then what'll happen, right? So if I start at a higher number and I go to a lower number, nothing happens, my range is empty. If I start at 6 and I go 6 plus 1 is 7, 7 greater than 1, yes, so it stops right away. But if I do minus 1, so now my rate of change instead of being positive is negative, and I run the same thing again, it goes 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. It still stops before the end number, but because it's going negative, so rate of change is going down the number line instead of up the number line, it works, which is pretty cool. So that's range in a nutshell. Going back to for loops, which I realize we've gone on a side note, but it's relevant and important. That's why we talk about it in the same thing. Now, if I wanted to actually change the value of each number in the nums list, I would say n, then I would say nums at n, right? So now I'm using the square brackets. So now the value of n changes, but I'm using that value to do something. I'm going to say plus equals 1. So now it's going to change the value of each number, and I'm going to print out nums at the end of this, and we'll print out nums before my loop starts. So at the start of my loop, the values are 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, and at the end of it, they're 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. Why? Because we accessed each one using the range, which gave us n to be a specific value. Now, instead of using the number that I know the length is, what I really should be doing is I should be using the built-in length. In case the number of items on my list changes, I don't want my program to throw an error. So I'm going to show you this over here, which is we do length of nums. So it first calculates, hey, how long is numbers? It's 6. Okay, so now I give range 6. And I run that, and it does the same thing. Now I can keep going with this, right? I can technically go 13, run it again, right? And it just adds 1 to the end. If I had done it with 6, it wouldn't go all the way through. That's why we use variables, and that's why we try to control our programs and make them as dynamic as possible. So that things like this, when changes are made, we don't run into errors. But all of that is a side note to explain the for loop. The for loop is like the while loop. The while loop says while this is true. The for is for each thing in here, but I need to name the things, right? Because now I'm referencing a bunch of stuff, so I need a name for that reference. I need a variable name, and so I use the variable, in this case, n. So for num in nums, or for n in range length thing. So here it's for list of the range is gonna, each one is referred to as n inside this block of code. Once this block of code is done, the n is no longer has a value, and we can ignore it or we can repurpose it for some other purpose. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. I know this is kind of a dense topic, and this one's one of those ones that can be a bit trickier, so if you have any questions, let me know, and I'm always happy to answer them or make an addendum as needed.